We're starting our study of Jonah today, and interestingly, when I first glanced at this weeks ago, I thought, "Oh, good, I'm doing Jonah," thinking it was going to be one lesson. Actually, we're going to spend the whole month on Jonah, believe it or not, because it's a very short chapter. It's very short, 4 chapters is all it is, and we'll devote 1 week to each chapter. And so I'm going to do a good part of chapter 1 today, and then we'll have chapters 2, 3, and 4 in the coming weeks. Nevertheless, I thought I'd start out by just giving a little background on Jonah, since it's our first week. And let me get my notes on that. The lesson is actually Jonah chapter 1, verses 7 through 17. I'm going to read starting at verse 1, actually, but before I do that, just a little bit of background. Jonah, Amittai's son. The book of Jonah has 2 main characters, one human, one divine. Of course, the divine is God. Jonah is a prophet. He's identified as Amittai's son. And the interesting thing is he's identified as one of the prophets, and that's where this book is inserted in the Old Testament. But it's different from all the other prophecies that we have because it's a narrative. It's a story that's being told by someone else about Jonah. So again, this idea of a story, we'll talk about that. But Jonah is, in fact, a historical character. We know that. He does appear again in the Old Testament in 2 Kings, chapter 14, verse 25. And it's there that Jonah prophesies that God would permit the then current ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel, Jeroboam II, to extend the country's borders. And this reluctant prophet identified in the book of Jonah is certainly the same person. Mainly, we know that because in the book of Jonah and also in Kings, he's identified as Jonah, Amittai's son. So we're pretty sure of that. So when was the ruling of Jeroboam II? It was like 783 to 743. So that's, the period somewhere in there that Jonah prophesies, and this story took place. As far as we probably all know the story and have since our childhood, and again, the question comes up, did this really take place? Is this to be taken literally or allegorically? So I guess we'll talk about that a little bit. The important thing is not that, but just the message as a whole. The message for Jonah as a whole, first of all, sort of a counterpoint to some of our, the way God is portrayed often in the Old Testament. We see throughout the Old Testament that God will judge and sometimes dole out justice to the righteous and punish the wicked, and this is a counterpoint to all of that, and it's so important, a lesson, one of the most important in the Old Testament, where it's not all about punishing the wicked, but rather forgiving them. And so it's interesting because the protagonist does not agree with that, doesn't agree with the way God wants to show mercy to people. Jonah's a champion of divine justice. He believes sin should be punished, and he's sort of outraged at God's forgiveness. But that's not this week's lesson. That's later, and we'll get into that. But today's lesson is more about running away from God. So we'll start with, a little more background, talk about just when this took place, who it was, and now I've got 2 sets of commentary here, and one is from the teacher's version of the adult Bible studies and the other from another source. And sure enough, the debate continues. Did this really take place? Is it literal, figurative, or what? From the teacher's commentary, it looks like it's being interpreted more as an allegorical story, but again, that's open to interpretation. We'll talk about that. But he goes on to say, while 2 Kings 14:25 is a comment about Jonah's role in an actual historical event, his activity in the book bearing his name should probably be understood differently. In the original Hebrew, the first word in the book of Jonah is weyihi. I'm probably not saying that right, which may be translated as it happened or it came to pass. It's sort of like the way our stories begin once upon a time. So he said in the introduction of the book of Jonah, the CEB, which is our Common English Bible, that's what we've been using this whole year, really. It says this particular story about a prophet named Jonah isn't historical in the narrow sense. Instead, readers should perceive Jonah as an extended metaphor marked by wordplay, suspense, intra-biblical allusion, satire, irony, hyperbole, and humor. Much like the parable, the book of Jonah teaches that deliverance belongs to the Lord, even if that deliverance comes to the most unlikely candidates. Much like a satire, Jonah contains extraordinary events, extravagant characters, designed to amuse and delight the reader. So he sort of thinks, well, this is a story. And maybe I lean towards that. I don't agree. I don't see satire in it. I do see humor. I see humor in this lesson today. I found some hidden humor in chapter 3, which is probably the most serious of the 4, and that's not the lesson today, so I'm not going to say any more, but that'll be your, see if you can find, there's one point that is I found extremely funny in a very sweet way. In fact, as I read through this, at some point in time, I thought this is the most wonderful story for children. And I thought, you know, if you do nothing else, you've got to, if you have grandchildren, or I think most of us are past having young children, but grand or great-grandchildren, this is, that would be a great book to give them. Some, you know, I guess a golden book, there's got to be plenty out there. I could just, in fact, I was kind of visualizing these illustrations in my mind. I thought, when I retire, I'm going to write a children's book of Jonah because it's so absolutely perfect. So, you know, that's kind of, you know, my interpretation. It's a story. I don't think whether you take it literally or allegorically that would dilute the potency of the message. And I don't think that in any case, God would hold us against us depending on what interpretation we take. So whether you're literal or figurative, I'm sure God is okay with that. And definitely after reading through this study guide and everything, I think the Methodist Church is fine with it just too as well. And they're okay with it. I found that the Methodist Church, they embrace everyone, and also they embrace a wide interpretation of things like this. So I'm sure they're fine with whatever your own interpretation is. No, speaking of which, I was reading a kind of biographical notes of George Lucas a couple weeks ago. It's really funny. George Lucas is a filmmaker and did the Indiana Jones series, the Star Wars series, and what have you. His first real success was American Graffiti. If anyone saw that, it was like 1962. Teenagers cruising around in California, you know, just driving around. It was like these guys, it was their last night of summer before they're going to go up to college and face adulthood, so to speak. So they're just having a good time. The background music is all like the, you know, late 50s, early 60s, up through the Beach Boys. It's sort of a time of innocence or whatever. And so, but reading about George Lucas is really interesting. He grew up in this very middle-class background, just as normal as apple pie. And of course that meant he was born and raised as a Methodist. And what's more normal than that? I mean, seriously. So, but now, I guess he's in his early 70s, and in this interview, they asked us, it came up, he said, what religion are you? And he said, I'm a Buddhist Methodist. Okay, all right. But I would imagine the Methodist Church is okay with that as well. So actually Buddhism, if you take it as a philosophy, I find it very compatible. There's these verses, Dhammapada, I think it's called. They're just verses, and if you ever read them, I think it would enforce your Christianity actually and really enhance your own Christian beliefs. But they do, in a lot of ways, if you take it philosophically, it is kind of, there are a lot of parallels. They definitely intersect. But anyhow, so yeah, George Lucas is a Buddhist Methodist, so that's good to know. So again, there's a wide interpretation here. All right, I think, let's see, I guess I'll start reading this and then we'll break it down chapter by chapter. Okay, Jonah flees from the Lord. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, and we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who's responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell to Jonah, on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What do you do? Where do you come from? What's your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it'll become calm. I know that this is my fault, and this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried to the Lord, "O Lord, please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, O Lord, have done as you please." Then they took Jonah, threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow down Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. So, there you have it. That's where we end today. Again, Jonah is fleeing from the Lord, and that's the lesson. He's physically fleeing from the Lord, but I think part of the lesson for us is we need to identify ourselves with Jonah, and maybe we're not physically, geographically fleeing the Lord, but we're probably fleeing from the Lord in other ways. And so I was trying to think of that, like how are we like Jonah? And there's a lot of ways. The first thing that came to mind is, well, Jonah was being selfish. So just in that sense, if we are ever selfish in putting our needs before others or before God's service, that's probably kind of akin to fleeing from the Lord. So when we read this, think of ourselves as Jonah as well. Okay, I'll start, let's now break down each chapter. I'll go back and I'll start with verse 1, even though the lesson starts with 7. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because the wickedness has come up before me. That's really important. He's being told to go to Nineveh. And Nineveh is in Assyria. It's the capital of Syria, and it was known for its, for sin and bloodthirsty kind of a place. And not only that, Assyria was an arch enemy of Israel. So all those, that's important to think that God is telling Jonah to go to this place that wasn't even in Israel. And that's really important, because a lot of times in the Old Testament, the Jews themselves thought of God as their God, not as everyone's God. And sometimes they miss that message that, yeah, they were selected, and but they were selected to be the light of the whole world, not just Israel. So this is an important message in Jonah. And it's funny, I mentioned that Jonah lived maybe around, let's say this was written around 750 BC. This actually, the book of Jonah probably was written in the post-exilic era, maybe 300 years later. It's not certain, but so up to that point in time, it was more of an oral tradition that was passed on from generation to generation. But I'm saying that because I'm thinking, wow, this really, you think, how did the post-exilic Jews who were back in Israel, how in the world would they have thought of this lesson in the terms of God being everyone's God, even the people of Nineveh in Assyria, the people that they hated so much? So this was really important for them to realize that this is everyone's God, not just Israel's God. So yeah, off he's supposed to go to Nineveh, and again, that'll be in a later chapter. For now, we're going to focus on where he's embarked on instead, which is the opposite direction. It says, but Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. Now, we're really not sure where Tarshish is. All we know is it's the opposite direction. It would be, and this is probably where the humor came in, they probably knew where Tarshish was at that point in time, and it's sort of been lost to history. And for someone hearing this story a couple thousand years ago, they probably would have laughed at that, because it's like, oh, saying he went off to Tarshish would be kind of like us going off to Timbuktu, that kind of thing. So yeah, like the total opposite. I wanted to look on the map. It's not even on the map. It was the furthest known point within the known civilized world at that point. And this, of course, is the Roman Empire, which was sometime later. Well, Tarshish, as far as it's been conjectured, there's several. One would be Carthage, which would be over here in North Africa, where Tunisia is even further over the coast of Spain. Lately, just off this map, there's two islands. There's Corsica and Sardinia. And it's thought that maybe Tarshish was Sardinia, which was about as far as you could go at that point in time. And no, there was at some point there was an inscription discovered on Sardinia, and it's called the Nora Stone, because there was a little town on Sardinia called Nora. And the inscription reads, he fought with the Sardinians at Tarshish and drove them out. Among the Sardinians he is now at peace. And then it goes on, but it kind of leads us to believe now that Tarshish must have been Sardinia, but not certain. In any event, it was far, far away. That's what we know. And there are a couple other references to Tarshish. Sort of like in the United States, there are 39 Springfields, and so, which can get confusing. And I know from working for the airlines, there's been more than one case that somebody was sent to Springfield, Illinois instead of Springfield, Missouri. So, you know, that can happen. So Tarshish, anyhow, a long, long way. All right, so that's the point there, and that's probably the humor from 2,500 years ago. Okay. Jonah ran away. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. Joppa is the ancient word. Today, that's known as Joppa, or Joppa is probably the correct pronunciation in Hebrew. And it's actually, it's on the coast, of course, surrounded by Tel Aviv, which is a modern city that was founded, I guess, in the early 1900s. But Joppa, now Joppa, is this ancient port. It's pretty well preserved. I should have brought in a picture because you get a really good visual image of what it looked like. It's got this very small little harbor, protected, and these old buildings that look like they date back to the time of Christ. And so, in any event, that's where he sailed from, off to Tarshish. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each one cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. So again, I think this is important to note that these sailors, much like you know, the various merchant marines today, sailors come from all seven seas. They come from all over the world. And I guess it was no different then. They were apparently from all over. They each had their own God, because in those times, each country had its God. That's why sometimes the Israelites, you know, would think of God as their God and not anyone else's. So important to note that. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. So, which is kind of ironic. In this storm, you go to sleep. It's sort of what I do when things trouble me, or I am kind of challenged in one way or the other. I fall asleep. Probably, so probably not the best thing.
Still a good Methodist.
It's allowed. But anyhow, the captain went down to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice and we will not perish." So this is when the lesson begins. That's all the background here. So the captain went down and woke him up. I hear everyone else. Yeah, Jonah, I mean, he's such a hapless character, and he's got a lot of faults, but I think we all like him. He's kind of a very likable character. But okay, so then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who's responsible for this calamity." So, okay, they cast lots. We're not exactly 100% sure how that was done or exactly what it was. It's sort of like flipping a coin or tossing the dice, that kind of thing. And it's interesting because it happens all the time in the Old Testament. And it even happens at the beginning of the New Testament, because the apostles cast lot on one or two occasions. We never see it. Interesting to note, we will never see that reference again after the Pentecost. And we're thinking, well, from that point on, you know, you do not cast lots to make a decision. You rely on the Holy Spirit and the wisdom and discernment that comes with that. So, but in the Old Testament, it was acceptable, and happens all the time. Usually, casting lots, if the lot was cast on you, it was probably a bad thing. Not always. Sometimes it was used to determine inheritance or one thing or another, but it appears pervasively through the Old Testament. So they cast lots. They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Okay, so they asked him, "Tell us, who's responsible for making this trouble? What do you do? Where do you come from? What's your country? What people are you?" And he answered, I'm Hebrew, I worship the Lord, the God in heaven who made the sea and the land. So, okay, he owned up to it. This terrified them. They asked, what have you done? They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. So here he has run away from the Lord. And this is the thing. And you'll notice by running away from the Lord, he's wreaking havoc not only on himself, but on others as well. And that's an important aspect of this lesson and what, we do when we run away from the Lord. It's not just going to impact us, it will impact others as well. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, what should you do to make the sea calm down? So again, he says, pick me up, throw me overboard. I deserve it. And maybe that was kind of a harsh sentence that he's imposed on himself. In fact, the sailors, to their credit, they did not want to do that. Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, but the sea grew even wilder than before. You can imagine, because the ships in those days, I guess it was with sails, but also with oars. So they're out there with the oar, the sea's going up and down. Their oars probably didn't even touch the water. So it was kind of, eventually they gave up. They tried and they tried and they gave up. So they did do their best. And they cried to the Lord, please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man. For you, O Lord, have done as you please. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. So there you have it. This makes me think, and I guess this is part of the lesson, how, even though Jonah has done wrong, he's done bad, and I guess this was a sin of sort, still God works in ways that even he's able to counter evil. He can turn evil into good, and in this case, that's what he's doing. Specifically, at this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. So I see good coming out of bad in this case, because all those sailors, each who had his own God, they recognized that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was the true God. So I think we had a lot of conversion going on there, and they said they feared the Lord, and they worshiped him from that point on. So I do see good coming from bad. Now I was thinking, going back to just a little sidelight, George Lucas, he was, if you did see American Graffiti, you know he was obsessed with cars. That was his life. He wanted to go into racing, actually. And at some point, he was in kind of a semi-professional circuit, and somebody sideswiped and the car flipped over. It nearly killed him. So he had a change of heart and became a filmmaker. So it's sort of like, something bad happened and then ultimately something good. And I think probably everyone can think of some circumstance like that where good came from bad or even from evil. It reminds me of my older sister. She was a federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice, and specifically the Organized Crime and Racketeering Division, something called RICO, Racketeering, Influence, Corruption Organizations. So this is back in the 80s, she was in Miami a lot when I was living down there, and specifically that division of the U.S. Attorney's Office was dealing with the cocaine cowboys of the 80s, and her specialty was asset forfeiture. It was down there, all these cocaine cowboys, their assets were being seized, and a lot of the asset forfeiture that she worked on ended up supporting and funding the University of Miami Jackson Memorial Hospital Burn Center, which is this multi-million-dollar facility. It's one of the leading burn treatment facilities in the United States. Compliments of the cocaine cowboys. So, that's a case of good coming out of bad. So that's a very important part of this lesson as well. So, but the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And I guess that's we'll debate that next week when I'm not here, whether did that happen or not. But it did happen exactly that way. But basically, again, so that wraps up chapter 1. He's fleeing from the Lord. Do we flee from the Lord? And maybe we'll find out that we have on one occasion or another. I think I probably underscored a few other things of note. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Says Jonah's story fits into this genre where Jonah was a man who disobeyed God, but through whom God still got his will done. So again, one way or the other, you can't run from God. He will find you. He'll track you down. And yeah, again, this is kind of repeating myself, but a lot of this bears repeating. In fact, that's the best way to learn is repetition, right? So I'll repeat myself. Okay, to the soldiers' credit, they resisted the idea of throwing Jonah over. Okay. They were all non-Israelites, pictured in a generous way. So that's why Jonah's so important. They really open the Israelites' eyes to the fact that they are, that God loves everyone and God has mercy on everyone. So, as the story will reveal, Jonah was running from God precisely because he did not want other non-Israelites, the people of Nineveh, to be spared destruction. So, again, I won't go there. Something absolutely amazing happens, and we'll see. But even the amazing thing that happens angers Jonah. So there's more to that. He isn't quite redeemed at this point. Hopefully you'll have time to contemplate those 3 days inside the whale, which we don't know. We know for the Bible, nowhere does it actually say a whale. It's a large fish. Is how, and again, it's sort of like this. The Lord provided a great fish, so it's sort of, and maybe this is a miracle of sorts, that this was not any known species, but something specifically a miracle for this particular situation, because he swallowed Jonah, and I guess in those 3 days he brought him back to as close to Nineveh as possible, which is, by the way, okay, so here's Jerusalem. This actually, talking about Israel at this point in time, it's already a separate kingdom from Judah. So we're talking about the northern part of present-day Israel. Jerusalem was the capital of Judah, Judea. Samaria was the capital of Israel. So it would have been somewhere around here, and then went, Joppa, it's on here. So he sailed from Joppa over here. Where's Nineveh? Nineveh would have been in Assyria, which would have been around Damascus in this area here. So you can see he went the opposite direction. But I think this great fish must have dropped him off somewhere along the coast there, as close to Nineveh as possible. So we'll figure that out. But yeah, he does end up going to Nineveh, and but even that doesn't resolve everything. It's not till the 4th chapter. And that's it. So basically, in the Bible, this is the whole of Jonah, except for a little verse on the end. So it's really very short, but wonderful story. So even just the first chapter, there were so many lessons in that, and then there'll be a whole lot more, probably even more important lessons. And,
Tom?
yes,
You mentioned Jaffa.
Jaffa.
On St. John's Bluff, just off of Beach Boulevard, there's a new restaurant called Jaffa, Y-A-F-A. Underneath it, it says, "A Taste of Jerusalem."
Is that right? Oh my gosh. Well, that's it. Jaffa is
Yeah.
Jaffa.
Yeah.
How cool. And they spelled it with a Y, I guess.
Y-A-F-A, yeah.
Oh, all right. Well, we'll have to go there. You know, let's totally immerse ourselves
It's
in
an
this
old
lesson.
Wendy's, I think.
Yeah, it's actually, they seem to be doing quite well. So many things have gone in there. That was a Wendy's, and there was bad happening there at Wendy's. So Wendy's just closed it down. And so there were a lot of others that came in, and nothing was successful, but this one just
Seems to be going
seems to
strong.
be going quite well.
And where is this?
It's on, it's about a block off the beach on, St.
St.
John's.
John's.